This is our 31st lesson on the introduction to the Bible, and we are continuing on the subject of textual criticism. I'll go back and review lesson 30, and some of the canons of textual criticism for both the neutral text and the eclectic schools are irrational. Now, the claim that there was a neutral text, we've already dealt with that earlier in one of the other lessons. And my 26th edition of the Nestle text says the neutral text idea has been retired. Okay, and they don't believe it anymore. Okay, so eclectic, I mean, you choose from all the different manuscripts, choose the one you think's best, right? And so that's their rule. And eclectic, you take a little of this, a little of that. Like I like Chinese food, and I like Mexican food, and I like German food. So I may go to some restaurant and they'll have a little of both in there, a cafeteria, and I may just get a little bit of everything. Okay, so I'm eclectic. All right. We've seen some of the canons that they're irrational, they're illogical. The more difficult reading, more probable reading has logical problems. The canon, the shorter reading, more probable reading has logical problems. Punitive error rule of textual criticism is shown to be irrational, and therefore it's useless. Caldwell's rule was shown to be irrational, and therefore it's useless, or to use it as a canon to determine the text is irrational. Any system that's based upon any of these four rules must be rejected by rational people. Reject them. Now let's look at the eclectic system of textual criticism. There's some logical problem with the claim that majority text is, they claim that majority text is a late text. I remember the majority text has three different names. They call it the Byzantine text because it was used by the Greek-speaking church. They call it the Syrian text because it was pretty strong in Syria, as when the church was strong there. Remember, Antioch of Syria was one of the places that sent out the Apostle Paul on his missionary journeys. And then it's also called the majority text because most of the manuscripts read like that text. So it has different names: majority text, Syrian text, and also the Byzantine text. Right? So I'm just going to use the term majority text to refer to these various other names. I'll be using them. Eclectic, according to Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, 10th edition, and you can type Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary on the internet and get it free. Get these definitions yourself. Eclectic is selecting what appears to be best in various doctrines, methods, or styles. And so they're choosing what seems to be best in the manuscripts is basically what you're doing. Well, if we had a good sound rule that gave us that right to do that, then that would be good. So it sounds good on the surface. The problem with this is to determine what appears to be best, see? And by what standard one determines what is best. So by what standard are you using? And of course, in practice, the textual critic has no real limitations on his choices other than his own thoughts, his biases. That's in practice. They have no real limitations if they take the eclectic view, that is. Right? Some of these fellows are using eclectic view, and they are not admitting it's eclectic. They don't like the term eclectic. Donald Flatt in the Restoration Quarterly, he wrote in that quarterly, it's a supposed scholarly journal about brethren, but a lot of them are pretty liberal on there. But there's some good articles in there. You can get some good information. And I don't subscribe to it. I will go to the library where I can read it once in a while. But thoroughgoing eclecticism is the method followed by the textual critic who pays far more attention to internal and contextual considerations and to questions of dates and families of manuscripts, according to Dow Flatt. Dow Flatt's dead now, so I believe he's died several years ago. He was a pretty straight fella, but that's his explanation of it. I'm going to use that explanation. So they're going to look at internal and textual criticisms, considerations to determine what manuscript they should follow, what family they should read the verse. Other names given to it are text criticism, and they give other name. People that try to put a good sounding name on their position, and so liberal political views are called progressive. See, because that sounds good. See, so they're progressive, and they'll put a bad name on your view if you're not progressive. And so that happens. So they want to call themselves rational criticism and impartial criticism. So that's the terms they like to use. Well, by using the term rational criticism, they're implying that any other system is not rational. See, it's not in agreement with them. So there's a subtle way of, by labeling, they get a point in, they make a point and get their position believed by people, or people accept it because they why they label things. That's done in politics too. So impartial criticism. So I'm impartial. If you don't follow my rules, you're not impartial. See? So that's the implication of labeling why they label themselves. Note that these names are given to their system imply that other systems are irrational and partial. They're partial and irrational. Eclecticism is the text criticism was first advocated by C.H. Turner and later championed by G.D. Kilpatrick and J.K. Elliott. So these are some of the men. I'm not going to spend time going into them. I've looked at their canons, and their canons are flawed, and I don't even care. I may study their readings because I have to, but if I do, I'm looking to see if they have logical flaws in their reasoning. And when they do, I'll document it and put it in my notes. Okay, that's what I'll do. I've already shot down their four main canons, and so I just have to reject it altogether. Now, Bruce Metzger, he's one of these fellows that is pretty strong in this area. He writes, and we have a side of it right here. The editor chooses that reading which commends to him as fitting the context, whether in style or contextual reference. Well, now, context can be kind of subjective if you're not careful. You can really twist the context if you got an axe to grind, or if you believe some false doctrine. Such an editor relegates the manuscripts to the role of supplier of readings. So his manuscripts they supply him with readings. And now this is the title of this site is Caldwell, Ernest C. Houghton, Redavicus, Hort Redavicus. Now this would be Westcott Hort, okay? A plea and a program. Studies and Methodology of Text Criticism, New Testament, Volume 9 of New Testament Tools and Studies, edited by Bruce M. Metzger. And this is full site and Leiden. I haven't bought the book. I borrowed it from someone and read it, went through it, and got this quote, another one or two out of it. And I saw that he's using all of these rules that are flawed. And of course, he starts out, the context tells me which one's right and which one's going to read the way I think it ought to read. That's basically what it boils down to. Now, Bruce Mesker goes on and says, but that the critic is concerned primarily with finding plausible reasons based on internal consideration to justify in each case his choice of one reading or as originally others as secondary. So the secondary is a wrong reading and the original is the correct reading. So he is concerned primarily with finding plausible reasons to justify in each case his choice. So he starts looking to justify his preconceived notion, basically is what he's saying. Right? And this is his book, which I did buy this. I bought about 3 books that have textual criticism and their views on it and the rules for it that are used by textbooks by colleges. Okay. So I do have this book, Text of the New Testament, its transmission, interruption, and restoration. Right? And I bought the latest edition. Okay. The question so far. So this right out of his book. Okay. Eclectic textual critic chooses a reading that best fits the writing style of the author. All right. So that implies that he has to understand the reading style of the author. All right. Some passages contain a Semitic Hebrew word order. And that's the claim that's made, and I think that's probably true. There are other considerations by eclectic textual critics, but we'll be brief in this study. I'm not going to go into all of these. This is one of the considerations they give. Logical argument of this principle. Let's lay it out logically. If there's a good reason for the writing style of passage X being any passage in question being different, then the text is not corrupted. So if there's a good reason, say, let's go back and see what they said. Let's go back. Ain't concerned primarily, let's go back further. Choosing reading which commands to him as fitting the context within style or contextual reference. Right? So he's going to look, and he's going to look at the one that commends to him as fitting the context within style or contextual reference. He's going to find plausible reasons and internal considerations to justify each case his choice of one reading as original, others as secondary. Right. We have some that have a Semitic Hebrew word order. The word order in all languages aren't the same. Let me illustrate with the English. We would say, you live in a beautiful house. The word beautiful would go before the word house. It would modify what follows it. And we wouldn't say, you live in a house beautiful. That would not be good English. But in Spanish, they would say, mi casa es su casa, my house is your house, or bonita. Casa bonita would be a beautiful house, or house beautiful, if you put it literally. The word beautiful, bonita, follows the word casa, or house. So Spanish has it after. So the word order of that adjective is different in Spanish than it is in English. Does that make sense? So you may have studied Little Spanish, I'm not sure. But what we have here is the word order in Semitic word order would be the word order of the Hebrew. And so he says some passages contain a Hebrew or Semitic word order. Semitic would be debt sentence of Shem. And there are other considerations about it, but we'll be brief in this study. Now let's look further. Logical argument. If there's a good reason for the writing style of passage X being different, then the text is not corrupted. Well, I believe I would agree with that. All right. If the writing style is different, and if the writing style has a Hebrew form, word order, and then he argues there's not a good reason for the writing style of passage X being different. Well, what's he done? What logical fallacy is he committed? Now, you two fellows are both in my Greek class, in my logic class. Can you tell me what fallacy he's just committed?
Denying the antecedent.
He denied the antecedent. That's a fact. The text is corrupted. The double negative becomes an affirmative. So that's exactly the whole logic, the whole argument is flawed. Okay? His approach to it is flawed. It's like some people that say, well, if you can prove that action X is sinful, then I will not do it. And what you need to say, if you can prove it's sinful, I won't do it. And you can't prove it's sinful, so I can do it. Well, that won't follow. Just because I can't prove something doesn't mean it's not true. Does that make sense? Again, you're denying the antecedent with that basic argument. So again, we've seen that in logic class. The problem with this argument is it commits a logical fallacy denying the antecedent. Any argument that commits a logical fallacy denying the antecedent is unsound. The conclusion is not proven by the argument. The conclusion might be true, but this argument doesn't prove it to be true. It has to be proven by another argument. This argument doesn't prove it's true. Okay. Word order. Now, regarding this word order, Kilpatrick, one of these fellows that's supposedly one of the big shots in this area, G.D. Kilpatrick, he says, frequently scribes eliminate instances of this word order, and sometimes Byzantine witnesses retain it where other manuscripts eliminate it. So the Byzantine, that would be the majority text, Syrian text, retain the word order of the Hebrew or Semitic word order. Right? Interestingly enough here, and this is G.D. Kilpatrick, Western text and original text of the Gospel in the Gospels and Acts, Journal of Theological Study. Here's the site for it. Back in 1943, that's the year I was born. I didn't know how old I am. Right? Semitic Hebrew word order, see, so way back then they were arguing this. So they retained it where other manuscripts eliminate. So he's saying that this Semitic word order is not right, or the retaining that word order when others eliminate it. So they're saying that there was a reason that the Eastern people wanted to retain it. I think they're basically saying they're wanting to influence the Jews. I think that's one of their arguments, that they had an evil motive. They had a good motive, but they were doing it wrong. They were changing the text to read like the Hebrew would read. So it might be more palatable to the Jews. Many textual critics claim the majority text is a recension of the 4th and 5th century. Now, what's a recension? That's where they get all the manuscripts together and decide, okay, here's how it reads, here's how it should read, right? So it's supposed to be a recension where the textual critics get together and say, here's the reading of the text. Actually, the Nestle Land and United Bible Society text is a recension. They admit it. So keep that in mind. So just because it's a recension, they won't say that all recensions are flawed, okay? Because they're claiming their recension is not flawed. Okay? So keep that in mind. So they're claiming that the majority text of Byzantine or Syrian text is a recension in the 4th and 5th century. Now, by the 4th and 5th centuries, the Jews had very little influence on the Christian community. They didn't have much influence by that time. So by that time, there was didn't have much influence. Jews were pretty limited in how much they could influence the church. The Greek-speaking people used the Septuagint LXX for their Old Testament, not the Hebrew. So they would quote from the Septuagint, and they were using it as their text because they were Greek-speaking, so they had a Greek Old Testament. They weren't teaching from the Hebrew Old Testament. Okay, so there was no reason for them to be influenced by the Hebrew in that regard. Therefore, there's absolutely no reason for the Greek-speaking people of the 4th and 5th centuries to write Semitic expressions into the Greek New Testament. See, that's what they're claiming. They wrote this in to influence the Jews. Okay? But so there's no reason for them to do it. And besides that, what they're using is it would be more influenced by the Septuagint, the LXX, and the Hebrew. Most reasonable explanation is that the original had some Semitic word orders. The majority text is the original text. Well, let's go back and see what books he's looking at. Back here. Let's go back quite a ways. All right. One of these slides told us it was in the Gospels, the manuscripts. I'm going back way far. All right, I'm sorry. I think one of them told us it was in Acts and the fourfold gospel. I'll go through it quickly. Okay. Oh, the title. The Western text and original text in the Gospels and Acts. Okay. That was the title. That's the title of it. Kilpatrick's. He's dealing with the Gospels. So you're trying to convert the Jews. Now I want to ask you, did one of the apostles, were Jesus teaching Jewish people during his lifetime? Yes. And so would he have perhaps used word expressions that were in agreement with their language? Well, yes. So the text itself would have had word expressions that were Semitic in their nature. Some of the ways that they said things would flow with the Hebrew way of thinking and way of speaking. And up until Acts 10, the church was preaching only to the Jews. So we have about 1/3 of the book of Acts was strictly to Jews. There was still Jewish influence in later parts of the book of Acts. So the fourfold Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the first 10 chapters of Acts, up to the first 9 chapters of Acts, would have been for Jews only. And then we have other passages later in the book of Acts that still were talking to Jews. So the fact that we have a Semitic influence is no strange if you're looking at those books particularly. Now, they're claiming that the majority text is the recension of the 4th and 5th century. Again, we've already laid out they didn't have much influence by that time. There's no reason for them speaking and to use Semitic expressions, change the reading to read that way. The most reasonable explanation is that the original had some Semitic word orders and the majority text is the original text. And we have some passages that have the Semitic word order that are not normally what you'd see in Greek. Matthew 6:11 in the Sermon on the Mount, Mark 10:51, and Acts 4:31. There's some others as well. Kilpatrick wrote, the Syrian, that would be Byzantine or majority text, often have retained Semitic features in the text, which have been eliminated elsewhere. We've already seen that. Most of these changes are inconsequential, however, that is, they do not greatly affect the doctrine being taught by the passages. There is some slight. I've gone to several websites on textual criticism. Many of them misrepresent John Burgon's, other logical errors, some of these textual critics. They frequently represent Burgon's method of counting manuscripts. Yeah. So I want to look at Burgon's view next week in our last lesson. has more than his method than merely counting manuscripts. They're misrepresenting that either they're ignorant of Burgon's methods or they're deliberately misrepresenting his methods and erecting a straw man. Now, heard of his methods and are unqualified to discuss his methods because they're ignorant of them. If they're deliberately misrepresenting his methods, then they're unworthy of an audience. All right? So those who misrepresent Burgon's methods are either unqualified or they're unworthy to discuss textual criticism. Now let's look back here. Let's go back to our text. We'll look at Burgon next week. And logical problems with the claim that the majority text is a late text. They're claiming it's a recension of the 4th or 5th century. Now, we've already proven from the writers of these textual critics that they agree that Tatian, T-A-T-I-A-N, and we saw that, I believe, last week in our lessons, that he died about 180 AD, that he was the last one to intentionally make changes in the text. That was the claim that's made. And if he's the last one, that's certainly not in the 4th or 5th century. So either the intentional corruption of the text ended before AD 200, Tatian claimed to be the last one that did, and tried to change the text, or it continued after AD 200. Now, the rule of excluded middle says it either is or is not. Most textual critics claim it ended by AD 200. Now, they get into a problem here with their reasoning there. Therefore, the conclusion is nobody was trying to change the text. The reading of the majority text existed prior to AD 200. There's nobody changing it purposely. Any changes would have been accidental. But they're claiming that the people that came up with that majority text, that they had on purpose. They changed it. And so they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. They're claiming nobody, and we get some quotes of some of these fellows, so we've already given them, that there was no deliberate changes after AD 180. Tatian died. But now they tell us in the 4th or 5th century they had a recension and they changed it on purpose. Which is it? It has to be one or the other. They're not both true. So that gets into a problem there with that. They're forced to claim that the majority text is a recension. The problem with this claim is that they do not have a single shred of evidence to support the claim. They don't have any documentation, historical record that says that they had a recension of the text at that time. No evidence whatsoever. But their view has to have it because they reject the majority text. Lack of evidence doesn't seem to bother some of these fellows. They just go right ahead. If all the readings of majority text existed prior to AD 200 and it's not a recension, then we can claim it's not a late text. If it existed then before AD 200, all the readings did. And in fact, what you run into, nearly every reading of the majority text is supported by some manuscripts that aren't part of the majority text tradition. And most of the readings, vast majority of them, are supported by some of these old manuscripts. So some of the old manuscripts actually agree with the majority text. And in my notes on my classes that I teach, I put the manuscripts in that agree. And you can go through my notes if you have them, electronic copies of them, and you can see what manuscripts, and some of those are some of the old manuscripts agree with the majority text. Most of the time there's some agreement, vast majority of the time. So, but if all the readings majority text existed prior to AD 200, it's not a recension, then we claim it's not a late text. Right? They all existed prior to AD 200, and there's no evidence then that the majority text is a recension. They don't have any shred of evidence. The lack of evidence, again, doesn't seem to bother them. There's no evidence majority text is a late text. So that kind of shoots down their view. The claim that majority text is the fourth, has the fourth, fifth century recension of the following logical errors. First, it begs the question, assumes what they're trying to prove, without supplying any evidence. It asks us to accept their claim without any evidence. In fact, they claim to be an authority that can issue claims without them being questioned. In question. Now, let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that they're right, that it is the 3rd or 4th century or 5th century recension. How do we know it's not a correct recension? Okay, now, just for the sake of argument, we're going to assume it is a recension. Then NA, Nestle Land, and UBS, United Bible Society text, are recensions, and they claim that they're superior text. So just because it's a recension doesn't mean it's a bad text. They don't say that all recensions are bad text, because their texts are recensions, say. But the existence of many Greek manuscripts in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, how do we know that the Byzantine text was not a correct recension, assuming it's a recension? How do we know it's not the correct recension? How do we know that these fellows, who were very close to the 1st century, how do we know they didn't know what texts had been modified and rejected them? See, they would be better suited to analyze the text than 21st century fellows, particularly fellows who are atheists and agnostics. Clearly, the 3rd century textual critics, those making the alleged Byzantine recension, would have hundreds, perhaps thousands of manuscripts that we do not have today. Therefore, if hypothetically, we're just being hypothetical, someone were to prove the majority text is the 3rd or 4th century recension, it would not necessarily prove it's an inferior text. In fact, some recensions are inferior texts and some are not. So the fact that it's a recension, if it is, let's assume it is, doesn't prove anything. Again, we go back to the square of opposition and see what they're saying. They don't say all recensions are inferior texts, because their Nestle Land and UBS text is a recension, but they claim it's superior text. So they have to say some are superior and some are not by their reasoning, but they can't prove anything by it. It doesn't prove anything. Logic gets into the same problem we had earlier with the other canons. Again, these people don't know how to reason. They don't reason right. Well, that's why they're atheists and agnostics. They haven't reasoned right from the evidence. 3rd century textual critics, those making the alleged Byzantine recension, would have more accurate knowledge of what intentional changes have been made by ones who were purposely corrupting the text. They could reject those manuscripts that have been corrupted real close to the original, much closer than we are, nearly 2 millenniums closer than we are. Now, I ask the question, why is there no historical evidence of such a recension? And now the fact that there's no evidence doesn't prove it didn't occur. I know that. That's argument from ignorance. But there's no historical evidence of a recension. If the recension corrupted the text, surely the church would have objected to this corruption. Somebody would have objected, but there's no objections in the historical record, none whatsoever. And this right here ought to put a flag up. A flag ought to go up. Several aspects of the eclectic textual criticism have logical problems. And we've shown another logical problem with their claim that it's a recension. And some textual critics represent Dean Burgon's methodology of textual criticism. They want to attack him. And of course, Wilbur Pickering has, I believe, the most reasonable. Now, Burgon's rules are, I believe, are good. And he makes some good arguments. So we'll try to look at his, and I will recommend a book that has some information in it for you. The claims that the majority text is a late text are irrational. First of all, they have to assume, and they beg the question, without any evidence. And we've seen that if they claim it's a recension, they don't believe all recensions are bad. Some are good, some are bad, according to them. So even if they proved it was a recension, they still have to prove it's a bad text. And so next lesson, we want to evaluate Dean Burgon's methodology. Any questions? All right.